Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Carbon Trust webinar on supply chain. My name is Marta Iglesias, and I work in the business services team at the Carbon Trust. And here is the agenda for today's session. We will begin with an introduction to supply chain and Scope 3 emissions. Then we will look into the drivers for organizations to focus on resource efficiency and emissions reduction in the supply chains. We will then talk about some possible approaches to address supply chain resource efficiency, then recap on the key benefits of managing your supply chain, and we'll then illustrate the points above with a few case studies of the work we have done with a number of companies. And finally, we will go through the key aspects of the Green Business Fund. So first, let's start with a few definitions about supply chain and Scope 3 emissions. And I'm aware that many of you may be familiar with the terminology, but the people in the audience comes from various backgrounds and functions, so it's useful to ensure we're all on the same page. So here is a diagram of the traditional value chain for an organization, which we will look at from the point of view of carbon emissions. In the middle circle, we have the organizational boundary, which includes the direct emissions from direct burning of fuels in the manufacturing processes, and also from emissions from the vehicle fleet, from sources such as natural gas used for heating, fugitive emissions from heating and ventilation units, etc. And it also includes indirect emissions from grid electricity. So these emissions within this circle are classified according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most widely used greenhouse gas accounting standard, as Scopes 1 and 2. Scope 1 being the direct utilization of fuels, and then Scope 2, the electricity, and also, if applicable, steam, imported steam. So these Scope 2 emissions are the organization is responsible for them, but they do not actually occur physically at the company's premises, but at the point where the electricity or the steam is generated. So if we now look at the emissions upstream and downstream of the organizational boundary, we'll be talking about what is known as Scope 3 emissions of that given organization. They are not direct, but the company has an influence over them. So upstream, on the left-hand side, we have all the processes involved in extraction or growing of the raw materials, the processing of those materials, the transportation, etc., until they reach the boundary of the organization we're talking about. And then downstream, to the right of the diagram, we're looking at all the emissions arising from the distribution of products to customers and consumers, the emissions during the life of the product, and also any emissions associated with any end-of-life treatment of that product. So when we talk about supply chain, we're talking about the upstream portion of this graph, so the extraction, processing of materials, generation of any intermediates, etc., until these products reach the boundary of the organization. And this diagram here also shows another representation of these scopes. It's a diagram from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and we can see the value chain emissions divided into scopes 1, 2, and 3. And we can also see all of the 15 subcategories in which the Greenhouse Gas Protocol categorizes the Scope 3 emissions, which range from purchased goods and services emissions, emissions from waste generated in operations, transportation, distribution, processing of sold products, etc. So, in summary, the key points about the value chain's emissions are the following. So, all organizations are responsible for indirect emissions that occur up and down the value chain. They can be upstream or downstream. And the supply chain emissions are those that occur in the upstream operations, from extraction and growing of raw materials up to delivery of products and services to the organizational boundary. So next, I'd like to look into why companies are focusing on resource efficiency and emission reduction in their supply chains. And I will begin by reminding us of some of the key global trends that will explain why so many companies have a key focus on this area. So let's look first at the context in which businesses operate today. We can see in this graph that globally, in the last 15 years, commodity prices have fluctuated by over 350%. Currently, there's an economic slowdown, particularly in China, and a lower price of oil. But if we look at the variability in the past few years and also the trends ahead of us, we see that the picture can actually look quite worrying. There is, we see here, there's a macro trend of a growing, wealthier, urbanized global middle class that will continue to put pressure in the planet's resources and therefore on prices in the longer term. And the prediction is for this middle class to double by 2030, adding over 2.5 billion consumers. It's also important to remember that climate change will produce additional pressures in the global supply chains with, for instance, the water demand gap predicted to rise by 40% by 2030. If we look a bit more specifically at the energy prices in the UK for electricity and gas, we can see that they have continued to rise over the last 10 years. And then if we bear in mind the growing global commitment to hold the increase in average temperatures below 2 degrees, it's expected that the global price for carbon will increase over the next few years as one of the mechanisms for the different countries to achieve their commitments. So considering all these trends, it becomes clear that those companies that want to remain competitive are looking to incorporate resource efficiency into all aspects that impact their supply chain resource use. So let's have a look now at what are some of the opportunities then for companies to look at capturing value in their value chain and the opportunities. So we can see here in this graph the carbon emissions in the value chain for a range of sectors. The light blue lines are the emissions of the direct operations of a typical company in that sector, whereas the dark blue and then the yellow lines are respectively the upstream and the downstream emissions. And as we can see, there's a large variability depending on the sector, but in general, there is a significant amount of carbon and therefore energy in the upstream operations. Again, we are talking about the raw material extraction, transportation, growing of any natural materials, processing, etc. And if we look specifically at the manufacturing sector in this pop-out here, what the graphs tell us is that in most sectors, again, embedded carbon emissions within the procured products and services are in many cases larger than the company's own energy and carbon footprint. So what this means is that actually the supply chain of an organization can act as a multiplier of energy, carbon, and in general resource-related risk. And we can make an analogy with an iceberg. So the operations of a certain company being the tip of the iceberg, but then below the water are all the hidden risks upstream of the supply chain that can, in many cases, be much larger than the portion that an organization is aware of. And many companies do have visibility of their immediate suppliers that we call tier 1. But then beyond this tier, there is often a long chain of suppliers that is not visible and presents a very potential significant impact. So if energy prices were, for instance, to rise with 10%, a company could see a similar, if not bigger, impact on their operating profits. Some analysis we've done has shown that if we take the example of a 10% rise in energy bills that I was talking about, and if we consider a large corporation, a FTSE 100 company, this could add between 40 million and over 400 million pounds annually to the energy bill of that company. So on the other hand, though, it's important to bear in mind that there are clear opportunities in the supply chain of any organization, because cost savings could be achieved by working with suppliers to improve energy efficiency. Again, through our experience over the last 15 years, we have seen that between 20 and 40% energy cost savings are often feasible across sectors, with short paybacks on the required capital investment. And then part of these savings could be passed on along the supply chain and minimizing costs and exposure to energy cost volatilities. We'll see a little later some of the approaches that companies are using to capture these opportunities. But before that, I wanted to cover another two key trends in sustainability that you've probably been hearing about, but that they are certainly driving further focus and action on supply chain sustainability. And I think it's important to be aware of them and to understand how they might affect your business, and also how you might be asked to respond to your customers. So the first one is the TCFD, which stands for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And this was set up by the G20's Financial Stability Board when they realized that there is a very significant risk that climate change poses to the global economy. So they've developed this framework, which is intended to help assess and communicate climate risks and opportunities with a view to make sure that the investment and the credit decisions are better informed and more effective. So because this disclosure is meant to form part of the public financial filings of an organization, of a large organization, this is therefore being taken very, very seriously by the companies that are thinking of adopting this framework for disclosure. So what's important to bear in mind is those companies that decide to disclose according to the TCFD guidelines will be looking at their supply chain partners to be able to understand the risk and opportunities in the supply chain, and they will want to understand as much as possible about resource efficiency, what are the energy sources, what's the resilience of the suppliers, what are possible disruptions coming from climate change or other matters. So they will need from their suppliers all this information to build up a clear picture and be able to adequately manage the risks. And the other trend I wanted to talk about is the trend for organizations to set themselves science-based targets on climate change. So these are targets for carbon emission reductions that are in line with the level of decarbonization required to keep the global temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. So currently over 400 corporates have committed to do this through the Science Based Targets Initiative, and this number continues to rise every week. The key point is that the companies that submit their targets to the SBTi for approval have to assess whether their Scope 3 indirect emissions are over 40% of the total value chain. And if that's the case, and as we've seen, this is the case in many sectors, they will have to set also ambitious emission reduction targets for their Scope 3 impacts. So again, this means that these leading organizations that are signing up to the Science Based Targets Initiative will be looking at their supply chain partners to be able to understand their emissions and to identify and commit to reductions in the future. So now let's have a look at how companies are addressing supply chain resource efficiency and what are some of the most common approaches. So in here we can see a diagram, a framework that we find useful to classify the approaches that companies can adopt to address emissions and supply chain efficiency. On the left-hand side, we are looking at supply chain approaches generally working directly with your supply chain partners on improvements, optimization, or more dramatic redesign of the supply chain. And on the on the right-hand side, we're looking at interventions based on an organization's products. And then if we look at the top of the diagram, we represent the more incremental approaches based on efficiency gains and incremental performance improvements. And on the bottom half, we're talking about more transformational and more innovative interventions, generally looking at closing the loop towards a circular business model in various degrees. So if we look at the most common approaches, we'll be looking at the top left quadrant, where we're looking at, as I mentioned, supplier performance interventions, and we'll see later a case study on this. And on the right-hand top quadrant, we're looking at product-focused approaches, looking at basically the company designing out risks and costs and emissions from the point of view of their own services. So this can be done through product design, such as reducing materials, reducing packaging, substituting for alternative materials, increasing the amount of recycled content, etc. Or also looking at their product portfolio. So companies might consider removing certain products or actually bringing alternative, more sustainable products into the market. So if we think about the top left quadrant in the supplier engagement and interventions for increasing supplier performance, we can see, and we have helped many companies in this area by looking at their spend in this way. So we can convert a company's procurement spend into carbon impact quite simply, and it's a quick exercise that allows them to prioritize then the supplier engagement programs, just looking at which suppliers have the largest impact onto their carbon emissions. So we see here in the graph that generally about 80% of the impact is concentrated in a very small number of suppliers or sectors, and then there is a much longer tail of suppliers that whose contribution is much smaller. Another way to look at supply chain sustainability is to evaluate the current supply chain management performance against best practice, looking at things such as supplier engagement, product design, procurement policies, communication, awareness, etc. And this is part of an assessment that we do as part of the Carbon Trust standard for supply chain. And I can, of course, share some more details of this separately. So when we talk about, as I mentioned in the previous diagram, when we talk about more transformational and more innovative approaches, these are generally looking at how to move from the traditional pattern of a supply chain, that is take, make, use and discard a product, like we see in this diagram. They're looking to move totally or partially to a closed business model where some companies are looking into remanufacturing a product and offering it again to a different set of consumers with a similar warranty, or closing the loop fully so that no value is lost and there's no final disposal of the product. And we at the Carbon Trust have supported many companies in every steps through their journey, and with many supply chain programs, depending on where they currently are. So we've supported companies analyzing their situation, articulating a business case, looking at with that diagram that I presented, looking at what are the most suitable and more adequate strategies for implementation. And one of the key learnings and important recommendations that we have seen with our experience to be able to implement a successful and coherent supply chain strategy program is to bear in mind that cross-functional collaboration is essential, really, and that it's necessary to involve procurement functions, supply chain functions, sustainability, R&D, product development, etc. And actually this is sometimes much easier and much more accessible in smaller and more flexible companies than it is the case for large corporations. So hopefully this is something that is achievable for many of the companies in the audience when thinking about redesign supply chain improvement program. So now, as a recap, I wanted to go through the key benefits for organizations to manage and improve their supply chain from an emissions point of view. So we can see, and we have been seeing some examples of these benefits, such as obviously reducing the organization's carbon emissions in Scope 3, potential cost impact and increased competitive advantage, reduce exposure to supply chain and cost volatility from an energy and resource point of view, enhanced supply chain network, improved reputation with customers and with other stakeholders. It's in many cases the key to drive innovation in product design or in business model design. It helps addressing customers' requirements for information or disclosure, as we saw from the TCFD and the Science-Based Target Initiative. And it certainly will support your credentials as a responsible supplier and any claims that you want to make in this area. So let's have a look at some of the case studies for companies that we've been working with. And the first one is focused on supplier performance improvement. We supported M&S in the development of bespoke supplier scorecards that rate their suppliers as gold, silver, or bronze, and that are now incorporated into the normal procurement processes. And the objective of these scorecards is to incentivize and to support at the same time their suppliers to invest in efficiency within their own operations and to set also a minimum acceptance standard of performance. So progressively the criteria get a bit stronger, and progressively M&S communicates to the different tiers of gold, silver, and bronze what their expectations are for them to move up the categories. Another case study that I'm showing here is the work we did with GSK, the pharmaceutical company. We calculated the Scope 3 footprint for their whole value chain that we can see here in this graph, from purchased goods and services to the end disposal of their product. And this analysis showed that 50% of their value chain emissions are in the upstream supply chain and in their purchased goods and services category. And this finding then led them to set up a supplier exchange platform to incentivize improvements and share best practice amongst suppliers. And they are hosting webinars, facilitating conversations, putting suppliers in touch with each other where relevant, to help them benefit from some advice and from some ideas on how to improve their energy efficiency and reduce their carbon emissions. Another example is the work we did with Carlsberg. Again, we footprinted their value chain, and a large proportion of their footprint is in their packaging materials. So this drove their work and their strategy to increase the amount of recycled material in the packaging, as well as looking into how to promote downstream use and recycling of the packaging. So those are the key areas that they are working in to address that 40% contribution to their value chain from packaging. And finally, one last example is the work we did with Mila on on their manufacturing of window handles. So we help them identify areas where product innovation could have a significant impact on the footprint of their product. And they identified a new approach that they were considering, which was the implementation of injection mold processing instead of zinc die cast. They analyzed the different options, and they identified with our help that this new process would result in a 60% reduction of the carbon footprint by reducing the energy consumption during manufacturing and also the shipping weight, and therefore the transportation emissions. And this had no impact on the quality of the product, so it was a very successful innovation. As I mentioned, it's another possible route for improvement and benefit of working in supply chain is to drive innovation by looking at where could you benefit more from taking action. And finally, I wanted to briefly talk about the Green Business Fund, which is a free service offered by the Carbon Trust to small and medium-sized businesses to help them gain knowledge and become more energy efficient. So I believe this may be of interest to some of you in the audience. So the Green Business Fund is available, as I said, to small and medium-sized businesses, schools, sole traders and charities in England, Scotland and Wales. And businesses need to meet 2 of the 3 criteria outlined here in this slide and not have more than 25% of their business owned by an entity who does not meet the SME criteria. We offer through the Green Business Fund energy efficiency training through 2-hour workshops hosted across the UK. And the workshops outline energy efficient behavior and equipment to help reduce the energy consumption. The next available workshops, as we can see here, are the ones in Swansea, Rotherham and Bolton. The Green Business Fund also offers opportunity assessment through remote or on-site visits. And this assessment will outline the top 3 cost-saving recommendations to become more energy efficient and reduce energy consumption. On the right-hand side, we can see there's also implementation advice available, which helps businesses find Carbon Trust accredited suppliers who will install the specified equipment for a specific business need. The fund also offers capital contribution to SMEs, offering 50% of the project cost up to a maximum of £5,000 for energy saving projects. Here we can see some other additional services, which are the Virtual Energy Manager, which is one-on-one tailored modules delivered by regular telephone calls to identify savings associated with energy management. We have technical webinars that are offered to learn about energy efficiency and business opportunities. And finally, publications also that can help provide information on how to become more energy efficient. The Green Business Fund also has more recently been developing a carbon footprint calculator, which aims to support SMEs to report their carbon footprint through entering some common emission sources, including electricity, gas and fuel consumption, and be able to then calculate their footprint. And this tool is now readily available on the Carbon Trust website. So thank you everyone for listening, and please feel free to contact us for further information on any of the topics we've covered today.